Kofi Bruce, sir, it is such a pleasure to have you on the Investing in Integrity podcast. How are you doing today, and where is this call finding you?
Well, I'm doing fine. I'm actually working from Denver, Colorado today.
I see. And what brings you to Denver?
Well, I have my wife and my youngest son live here now, and my youngest son is going to an autism-focused charter academy here in town, and so I'm telecommuting. I work about a week a month here in Denver, so I can see my family, and the other 3 weeks of the month I'm in Minneapolis.
Very cool. Very cool. And it's awesome that you're able to find that school in Denver. Your other son is going to college in Denver as well. So it all works out perfectly, if I
It
recall.
works out perfectly. Three out of the four members of my household are here in Denver, and say what you want. There are worse places to visit and spend time. It's absolutely beautiful here, and I think that the one sort of benefit of the pandemic is that we've all learned we can work from just about anywhere, at least anywhere where there's a good internet connection. So this is possible with flexible and hybrid work arrangements.
Amazing. Amazing. I'm glad you're enjoying it out in Denver. One of my best friends lives there. It's a beautiful city. Well, Kofi, I'm excited to dive right in. We have less than an hour today for this episode of the Investing in Integrity podcast. I've been so excited to have you on the podcast. You and I have had a number of conversations. You've become a very close mentor, friend, supporter of Scholars of Finance. And I've just been dying to have you come and share your insights with the rest of our community, so I don't hog you all to myself. Before we get into what will be a wider conversation about leadership and values, among a few other topics, I'd like to just start off by discussing your career arc from a macro perspective. So, for the listeners, can you just start by walking through your career up to this point, a little bit about your story and background?
Sure. Well, it probably helps for me to rewind to high school, where when I entered college, I was certain that I wanted to be an ambassador when I grew up, quote unquote. And I'm using air quotes, which doesn't work on a podcast, but just imagine it. And so I was in my mind, on a path to study international relations, probably go to the Peace Corps after college for a couple of years, come back, get a master's and a PhD in international affairs, and then go work for the World Health Organization or the UN, or the U.S. State Department. So that was kind of my thinking, and like most plans when you're 17 and 18, you've got it all neatly laid out in a line, and there's a linear progression, and it's a straight line from where you sit to where you end up when you're ancient at 45 years old, or whatever you imagine it means to be grown up and have arrived. And that's just not the way my career played out, in part because other paths opened up along the way. Circumstance brought me to certain opportunities, and one of the things that happened was, I did follow the first part of the plan, studied international relations. I actually went through Peace Corps interviews, and then I needed to find something to do for about 9 months. And I had to pay bills while I was waiting for the Peace Corps posting to come. And so I took a job in the private sector, or worked in mortgage banking, and I found there were a lot of skills that I had that were useful around project management, collaboration, but primarily around people leadership and organizing against an objective, and driving, and seeing something from beginning to finish. And I actually found that strangely seductive. And so, I started rethinking over the course of those 9 months whether or not I wanted to go to the Peace Corps, and then ultimately kind of passed on going to the Peace Corps and said, well, I'll do this for another year and then apply to, then I'll go to grad school. So I kind of went through a transition there as well. As I got into year two, I found I was really enjoying it. I was actually good at business, and lo and behold, even though I come from a family of people who do, kind of more public oriented and social oriented enterprise, that I was enjoying actually the corporate world. It wasn't actually evil. That organizations are full of people, and people who have values, and that you can do good even if you work in the corporate environment. So for me, a lot of it was, is there a way for me to find an authentic path that works for me in corporate America? And I ultimately, kind of let go of my dream of going down the road of becoming, an ambassador or working for the UN, in part because what I saw was a road where I'd be writing, white papers for somebody who might be in a room to influence the person who might make the decision, as opposed to one of the things that I really enjoy about business. You're forward. You're working problems forward, and you are, principal in that. So that was ultimately what got me to business school. And it's not like I went in at any point and declared I would like to be a public company chief financial officer. I wouldn't have known what that was when I was 17, for all the reasons that I talked about. And for me, along the way, it was I had good mentors, good advocates, and good sponsors who at times saw more for me than I did, and put and open doors for me to take opportunities that set me up with a set of experiences that made me a viable candidate ultimately for the CFO role that I now sit in. So it is, it looks neat on paper, but I will tell you, like anybody's career, most people aren't necessarily doing exactly what they thought they'd be doing when they were 17. And I'm certainly a good example of being open to new paths, and open to doors that may appear along the way that weren't expected, and having the curiosity to explore them if your interest takes you there.
I can definitely relate on the notion that I'm also not where I was. I'm not where I expected to be when I was 17 years old. If you had told me I'd be
Right,
the CEO and co-founder of a nonprofit when I'm 30, I would have laughed at you at that time.
right,
But
but at the same time, you're quite fulfilled by what you're doing, right? I mean,
oh,
and
deeply fulfilled.
and you followed a passion that you didn't knew you had at the time, right? So
Mhm.
I think that your career arc, and you and I have talked about it, is a perfect example of that as well. And that you found something that fulfills your head, your heart, and your soul at the same time, um, even though it's not the path you're on. And I'm sure you'd tell anybody listening that it's not easy, but you probably don't regret it.
Zero regrets. Economic sacrifice, all the things that one could regret, no regrets whatsoever. I wanted to ask you, can you pinpoint for me the aspects of General Mills that differentiated it from other companies that led you to building out your career there long term? Because you've had a number of roles at a number of firms, but
Sure.
you've really had staying power at General Mills. Would love to hear more about what drove that and what's driven the excitement about the firm.
I had the privilege of working at three great companies over the course of my career. The first of which was Ford Motor Company, which was a tremendous place to learn those foundational finance skills. I was there 6 years, and in 6 years had seven different roles, and it's really was a model that I think helped me develop the confidence, that I could be in any situation and learn the skills necessary to become effective, in a very short period of time. And the beauty of that was that that put me in a position to move on to be successful at EcoLab, and then ultimately at General Mills. And your question about why General Mills, and why have I been at General Mills 12 years? I've been there longer than the other two companies combined. The reason for that is the culture. You pick a lot of things when you decide to work in a place or in an industry. Um, you know, Lifestyle sometimes is part of that for sure. If you go into nonprofit versus for profit, but candidly, one of the most important things that people talk about the least is corporate culture. And that for me, foundationally, was one of the reasons why I selected General Mills. I talked to people. I talked to probably 20 plus people along the way in my journey to General Mills, and what I learned was, um, the amount of time that people spent talking about people, how energized they were by the strength of the people around them, how that made them better, as technical professionals, but also made them better business professionals. How strong the ethics were around everything from financial statements and the core things, but also the way and the belief that the power of people in teams could unlock and solve almost any major issue the company confronted. And for me, I found that they probably undersold it a little on the front when I came into the organization, and I found that to be true. And that's every time I have questioned whether or not I should be at General Mills, that has been the thing that has pulled me back into its orbit. Is that I have been hard pressed to see and find other places where the culture is that strong, where the ties between employees, leadership, and the center of the organization around a set of values and a mission and purpose are as tight. And that is, I think for me, probably one of the things that differentiates it. I could have made more money, certainly in other industries, but even at other companies potentially. But that was not the primary thing that motivates me. You spend, 60, 70% of your waking hours at work. I think it's really important that you pick a place that you don't dread going into, but more important that if you are energized to go in and work with and motivated by not letting those people down, motivated by winning with that team, it's a very powerful thing. And it should not be taken lightly in your calculus as you think about where you want to work.
I love it. I love it. And I want to actually pivot the conversation a little bit. That's a perfect segue into, I think, the crux of our conversation, which is values based leadership, people based leadership, authentic leadership, something that you've thought about a great deal over decades and that we've talked about a lot. And I think you always have really, really salient insights on. In a recent video that you did with the Aspen Institute, you brought up that almost immediately after you stepped into your role as the CFO of General Mills, the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And in the video, you speak to the fact that there was no playbook for COVID, which released expectations and really enabled you to lead authentically. And knowing that you were overseeing over 1,200 employees at the time, would love to hear the story of how authentic leadership bared out for you and what authentic leadership meant to you uniquely in that time. How did you employ it? What did it look like? What were the results?
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. If you think about kind of some of the old models of leadership, right? There's this person or figure at the top of an organization, a function, whatever, that has all of the answers and the wisdom and the experience and knows exactly what to do in every situation and is never beset by fear or any of the sort of normal human foibles or challenges that we all know we confront. Right. And there's an expectation that that's projected at all times and in all circumstances. And I think that's part of what I was kind of getting at is, going into my role, I followed somebody who'd done the job for 13 years. Was, if just by frame of reference, that's probably close to almost 3 times the tenure of your average public company CFO. So a long time, certainly by any relative measure, and was a known fixture in the analyst community, certainly within the company, and frankly in the broader community. So you follow somebody like that, it is very easy to focus on the places that you're different and the places where maybe you don't have strengths where this person did, and maybe be worried that the places where you have strengths though will not be appreciated. By contrast, and I think that the benefit of going into COVID was all of the time and energy that maybe I would have put in, or frankly even others from outside would have put into figuring out, well, how am I different than my predecessor, or what are the things that maybe he's uncertain about. The benefit of COVID was that nobody was certain about anything. And the minute I figured that out, the minute I saw that CFOs who I was talking to had been in jobs for 15 years and those who'd been in role for 5 months or 2.5, in my case, they really didn't have answers. There wasn't a playbook that they could pull out and say, well, here's what we do, and then we do this, and then after that we do this. We were all trying to figure it out together, and I realized, okay, well, we're all kind of starting from the same spot. and I have the rest of this is going to fall back on the strengths I already have around being able to speak clearly, speak from a place of values, to frankly just show up at some level as a human being who's also dealing with this on a human level at a time when people in our organization and the broader community in the world were afraid, right? I mean, that's the observation at the center of of why I kind of got into a state of, okay, well, I can work through this. This actually plays to my strengths because one of the things I picked up was that learning agility from my time at Ford. Um, the fluency of being able to go into an unknown situation and start to figure out what matters and where to lean and where to push.
That's super interesting. So, really tactically, think for our listeners who are trying to lead authentically right now, um, tell me about some of those conversations that you had, right? Some of those strategies, some of those tactics. It sounds like you really leaned into embrace confront the brutal facts, as Jim Collins would say.
Yeah.
There's ambiguity, there's uncertainty, have to embrace it and have to navigate it. And then once you had this clarity and now you're going to your team, tell us what was your leadership style? How did you lead in that time? What were some of those strategies and tactics that you employed and that you found were really effective?
Yeah. Well, I think the first is you just had to be over indexing on communication and listening, right? So the combination of those two, listening, in particular for where people are at. I'd say you went through a lot of cycles during the pandemic. The early phase of fear and just a lot of discretionary effort from everybody, kind of always on, all the time, working the issues to something close to exhaustion because people started to realize this was a longer haul than we thought. Right? It wasn't. We were working from home for a couple of weeks, and in lockdown for a couple of weeks, it was like, oh, this is going to turn into months and maybe even a year, right? And I think listening to people and being able to understand, okay, well, what people are right now need attention to is maybe their exhaustion. Not they know what to do. They don't necessarily need me doing things other than clarifying these are the two or three things that are most important. But they know how to go do their jobs. What they need is help and permission to do the things that help feed their self, restore energy, get refocused and repurposed. And it was different at different points of the pandemic. So you have to be listening for that. So you can't go into that with a fixed mindset. And then the other is you have to always be, for me, what it was I found I had to communicate twice as much as I was comfortable with. Um, and communicate from both a place of clarifying and simplifying things that we needed to do on the practical side, but also speaking to some of the challenges of the moment. So, for example, when Ahmaud Arbery was killed, right, and when we had George Floyd in Minneapolis was killed, those were points at which I stepped in and had to speak to the fact that these were issues that people were now carrying in the background of an already stressed time, and you could see that it was wearing on people, the social distress at a time of all of this unrest and disruption due to the pandemic. And so I processed that at a very human level personally, but I also felt it was important for me to show that to people too as I was communicating. So things such as, I would also record. I recorded a couple of videos during that period. One of which I read the Langston Hughes poem and talked about the impact some of these events were having on me personally as a Black American, but also kind of tried to find the points of things that I found optimism in what was kind of a dark period. And that later turned into a conversation later in the year about Asian hate, rising anti-Semitism. There were a lot of points along the year. If you look at the past year and a half, where I had opportunities to speak authentically to the organization as an individual and show up as an individual first and provide that vulnerability, because that opens the door for people to say, okay, well, I don't also have to show up as an automaton to work. I can, these things impact me, and it's okay that they impact me.
Hmm.
And actually putting people in a place where we can have that conversation at work, I think made them feel more engaged, as a result of having a place where that kind of vulnerability was allowed, where those kind of courageous conversations were allowed, where people could say, look, this kind of thing happened to me, or this is what I'm experiencing. Here's how I'm processing this. Because the reality
Hmm.
is, even in the old construct, where people show up, you just do the job and you don't talk about anything else. People are still processing these things. They just kept them hidden, and that extra burden, in particular on people who are experiencing them on a personal level, is a lot to ask. And it's a lot to ask, especially at a time when you have so much fear, broadly in the environment due to the pandemic.
It's so interesting, this the level and the degree of empathy that you approach the situation with. Vulnerability, I think, being a key insight there as well. Over indexing on communication. One really practical question that I want to ask for your thoughts on for our listeners' sake is how one can find their authentic leadership style. Do you think it's a process of trial and error? Is it taking your disc profile test and then working towards your strengths? Is it working with a coach? Is it some gradual process of insights that compound over time into this self-awareness or a new sense of self? I mean, I'm personally a believer that with honest intention, good strategy, and real effort, we can accelerate the process of becoming self aware and understanding ourselves authentically. I'm curious for what, in your experience, has been most beneficial, most effective for identifying your authentic leadership style.
Well, I think that what you just articulated is actually very, very insightful, and probably closer to what I believe, in terms of what finding your authentic style. It's unique for everybody, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
the one thing I will tell you is it's not comfortable, because if it's comfortable, you're probably, that tells me you're probably not really putting yourself out there in some capacity. I don't think everybody on my leadership team would necessarily process issues the way I do, and therefore, what would be authentic for somebody else, who's a peer of mine, is not going to look like what I show up with. But it actually has the same currency and value if they show up with it, because people can see them being intentional and putting energy into it. And if it is something that allows them to both be more accessible as a leader and connect with people differentially, I think that's what you're looking for. And I can't answer for you what it is, or I can answer what it is for me. I do think it is learned and practiced, more important than anything. And you won't get it right. You will find that not everybody also responds to it the same way. That's always the challenge of leadership. That's why I think being authentic is important. Is that not everybody's going to like everything you do all the time. You just are. You're comfortable with. If you're comfortable with that, then as a leader, it works on this principle as well, right? So you will try things that you think are in advancing your authenticity, and if it works, keep practicing it. And if you're finding it's not working and it's not connecting, then get feedback. That's the tough part about being leaders. You get lots of opportunities for feedback. You usually have to ask for them. And then you have to be open to changing. And I think that's the hard part, is you're on a very public stage in some ways, and you going through a process of, I'm trying to get better at this, and you told me I'm not as good at this as I thought, right? And then doing something with that and practicing it's all in public. um, so I think that's where the point of vulnerability, comes from, because I think if people see you're doing it, it's earnest, and it comes from a place of positive intent. I think you're going to get you're probably closer to the mark than not.
That's really, really helpful. I think this notion that it takes practice, it's learned. We have to grow self aware. We have to understand what uniquely works for us and lean into that. I would say in my own personal early leadership journey, and I'm very very early in my leadership journey still, if I can even claim to be on one at this point. Um, that I found embracing the fact that not everyone will agree with your plan or your path. That was really, really difficult in the beginning.
Yeah.
And I think where I found solace, and I talk to our students a lot about this, is, as you kind of grow from adolescence, teenage, early 20s, you're insecure, you're riddled with questions, worried what other people will think about you, public opinion and perception. And we see people in our lives, adults, who seem to have this clear, grounded confidence. And I remember at a young age wondering where that came from. And the best answer I found so far is in mission, values, principles, right? Being very, very thoughtful and intentional about who I am and what I stand for,
Mhm.
and making that choice consciously, right?
Mhm.
Choosing my identity, choosing my values, choosing my principles, not just being a product of my environment. And then
Mhm.
in those moments of uncertainty, I have those values and principles that I can lean into. That I have a one-page document. I go on a silent retreat every 6 months, and I spend 2 days with it to refine it and curate it, make sure that it is the best reflection of the leader that I want to be. And we've talked about these retreats a lot with our friend with Christopher Ellis, with a number of people in our community. Um, but I know that values-based leadership is so important to you.
Mhm.
This is the topic that I was most excited to discuss today. Would love to hear from you, sort of your definition of values-based leadership, your journey with values-based leadership. Would love to just hear your perspective on values-based leadership at a high level.
Yeah. Look, I think the importance of values-based leadership has been reflected back to us very acutely in this window here that we're in that organizations and institutions, as we're navigating all the social disruptions, but businesses in particular, have been called upon to respond from a place of values, and not just value, and value, along the spectrum of shareholders, value to customers and consumers, but values, and ethics, have come to the fore as expectations. And it's, for some companies, I see it's a very fraught landscape. But for others, such as the one that I work at, I have the privilege to work at and for, I have found amazing ease and fluency with us sort of, just playing frankly a hand that we were already pretty comfortable playing, and that there's a set of values built from a common mission. We serve the world, the food the world loves, and that mission was important, in particular in this window, and highlighted and engaging, for the organization. But what also was at the center of that was a set of values around how we treat people, our role in the community, that guided how we spoke to issues that came to us in this time when customers and employees are looking for the company to be more public and open about, its view on any number of things. And I think for me, what we are is kind of maybe at a different inflection point in capitalism. Capitalism starts with the view on efficiency, and we know that is far and away, for all its warts, one of the most successful ways to unleash, growth. It doesn't necessarily answer a lot of these social questions, but that doesn't mean that business doesn't have a role to play in addressing some of these social questions. So, as leaders, the challenge for us is, where do you pick your spots? What kind of voice do you speak with? And I think that the challenge for any leader in this window is, you speak both for the company, you speak for yourself, and people are watching in a way that I think they haven't for a long time. Corporate institutions. I mean, the level of trust in corporate institutions is generally higher than a lot of government institutions at this point. I might note. Right now, that you can argue that's a low bar, but it also happens to be true. Um, so I think I do think there's opportunity here for companies that are clear on what they're about, clear, and led by people who have the vision and the comfort to speak authentically to values, to differentiate themselves. And then lastly, I think institutions as a whole do have a responsibility to society to answer some of these questions, right? I mean, part of the role companies play is to employ people to support the livelihoods of millions. Um, and it's hard to do that and have no concern for the particular moral questions in front of the people that you both serve and who work for you.
Thanks so much for sharing. I appreciate it. And I was just muted as I was sneezing on
I
my
saw
end
that.
here. For all of our listeners, forgive the delay. I'm like sneezing
It was a
violently over
huge
here as
piece, but you should be all be happy, listeners, that he put himself on mute.
I was going to say, Kofi, I really appreciate the point on the opportunity that exists for leaders to authentically speak to values and have a set of values that they refer back to for hard decisions, for difficult decisions, or even issues that come up. I would love to hear, I guess, kind of two questions. One, just a few examples of times where you felt you exemplified your values with your team and
Mhm.
how that impacted the way they interact with you, each other, right? How that impacted the business.
Yeah.
And I mean, really kind of leveling up that a bit. We can talk about our values, but hard situations are where they get put to the test, right? Earlier this year, General Mills started going through a restructuring and was expecting to cut up to 1,400 jobs. And
Mhm.
as a leader, this can be extremely difficult to manage, I would imagine, as you or members of your team may fear that their jobs could be at jeopardy. And so
Mhm.
that's one example that I think our listeners would be really interested in hearing about of where you applied your values and how you thought through difficult decisions from a values based perspective.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. Look, and to your point, we did take some organizational restructuring actions earlier this year. And part of the measure of values and how they show up when you go through and do the hard things, right? And it was a set of actions taken to further our strategy. And I think you may have to trust me when I say, when you sit in a position like mine, it is very hard not to feel very personally accountable to everybody in the organization, including all of the people whose jobs are impacted when you make decisions like this. Um, the things that are super important from a value standpoint are being clear and transparent about the purpose and the need to act, being humane about how you deliver messages, honoring the service, sometimes decades long service of the people in the organization who've served with you, and then also painting a picture for the people remaining, the vast majority of people remaining at the organization, about the future and where you're going to. And I think all those things can be done with an eye towards empathy, um, and done with appropriate deliberation so they don't feel careless and wanton. Um, and even with that, you will still have, sleepless nights and all the challenges that go with any decision, like any major tough decision. But I think the key is no different than the kind of challenges you face when you have something really, really negative happen in your community, like an act of police violence, like we saw with George Floyd. And I can tell you that at that point I was first an employee and a member of the community who saw this and was distressed. And then I turned to thinking within a matter of hours, okay, well, what I'm a leader in this organization, what are we as an organization going to do? And by the time I had talked to my CEO, he had already drafted a statement. I hadn't had to talk to him about it, and it's amazingly powerful when, as a senior black executive in an organization, I didn't have to push that conversation. I didn't have to push it because the values in the organization and the values of the leaders around me, and in this case, the leader above me, had already put the question on the table, and we're moving in that direction because our values would have guided us there, right? So I think that, to me, those are the litmus tests of your values, come when it's hard, not when it's easy, not when you drop press releases, but when it's hard, and
Mm-hmm.
maybe you know that it might even be controversial. Um, because
Mhm.
I guarantee you, anytime you make a statement of any sort or you take a position of any sort, you are going to upset somebody. And these days, I think it may well be very public. So you have to be comfortable choosing as a leader, and choosing sometimes has that consequence.
It's hard. It's easier to hear it and think we understand it than to actually experience it. I remember in my early days of being a leader, of being a CEO of a small organization that's growing, but those moments where I made those decisions, where we labored over them, we stared at our mission, our values, our principles, and we debated, discussed, had dialectic. We really thought we were doing the right thing,
Yeah.
and that we had come to the approach that was best for our vision, our mission, for all of our members. And there has always been someone who doesn't agree,
Yeah.
who thinks that we're going
Maybe,
off in the wrong
maybe
direction.
vociferously so, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you bringing up the killing of George Floyd and several others, right? We had sort of this kind of racial reckoning and awakening, I think, in terms of equity and the disparities that we see in our society over the last couple of years. And
Yep.
we as a human race have had to have this reckoning over and over and over again, as our consciousness and as equity continues to evolve and improve. And I'd actually like to pivot the conversation there for a few minutes. Um, Last year, a figure in the Wall Street Journal stated that less than 10% of CFO positions in the S&P 500 and Fortune 500 were held by non-white executives. And another staggering figure in that same article found that only 12 of 675 sitting CFOs are black. And
Yep.
so I wanted to ask you, especially over the last couple of years, as a black CFO of a leading multinational company, have you experienced any added sense of pressure, right, that comes with being a representative in a position of power and influence of a historically underrepresented community?
Yeah, look, I think the short answer is absolutely. I feel a tremendous responsibility to make sure that I open the doors wider for people behind me. I think it should not be so that there are so few of us. And there's probably more now. I actually recently, along with a few other CFOs, one of whom is Reggie Hayes, started a group, uh, essentially a networking group for Black CFOs. In part because I think we see this as work that needs to be done. But the other is, it is helpful to have a place where you can talk to people who are maybe wearing that same multiple hat, leadership, mantle that you've got to carry as a black executive, or as a female executive, or as a person of color in a C-suite role, and that you are an enterprise leader. You are a leader potentially of a function. You're a leader within a community, and then you're an individual who may be part of a group that is traditionally had less access to roles with this kind of power, and you're always kind of navigating and having to wear multiple hats, and figure out which one you're wearing at any given time, and having a set of fellow travelers on that journey is incredibly useful. um, but I do think the challenge is just that, as you said, which is there's still few. There should be more. There should be more, and should have been more sooner. So I'm glad we're talking about it now, but there's still a lot of work to do, and frankly, the path to get there is still not overly easy. There are a lot of places along the way where really really good people of any background maybe miss out. And so I think the benefit of kind of sharing the experience of how do you get to this role, and talking about the challenges once you are in this role, and working through them with a group of people who have those same challenges is exceedingly helpful. But I think you're on the point. The point for me is more that you're wearing multiple hats at any given time, and at any given time you probably need to pick up the one and wear the one that's heaviest. And last year for me, the one that was probably heaviest was the one around a lot of the racial and social injustice that was happening around us and was on display and in the public conversation, and knowing that there were people in the organization asking and wanting and needing to have leaders speak to that, and me being able to have a unique and authentic voice on those topics from my own experience.
In recent years, there's been this significantly increased focus on DEI, not only in finance, but in the rest of the business world. And I think the events of the last couple of years have obviously accelerated that. Do you think this increased focus has had any material impact yet? And I'm curious what impact you think it will actually have for financial professionals on the finance industry as well.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I think it is having an impact. I've networked with a lot of CFOs of public companies, and even last summer, not this last one, but the one before, when George, shortly after the killing of George Floyd, when we were talking about how companies were dealing with this, I remember one CFO, unnamed CFO, remarked something to the effect of, "Well, it's all above my pay grade," meaning I don't understand this. What's my role in this? And I kind of had to stop and say, look, I'm just going to say this more as a point of observation. It can't always just be in this case, your Black executives on your leadership team, because there probably aren't enough. And there probably aren't any on some of your leadership teams to speak to these issues. And yet your organization, it has people at lower levels who want and need to hear. And so I do think, increasingly CFOs are called into conversations on these issues. ESG is a perfect example. It includes not only social issues, but sustainability and corporate governance. And as you start to think about it, there are a lot of places there where companies are making commitments. There's measurement that needs to happen. And there's certainly a lot of funding in some cases, and CFOs need to be engaged in those discussions in ways that they weren't even 2 or 3 years ago. So I do see a huge role for CFOs to play here. This is not just the province of the CEO, and frankly even of other leaders in the business, but I think the CFO has a unique and important role to play. And if you aren't ready for it, I would tell you it's coming either way.
We're grateful that it's coming. We're grateful that it's coming. On the Scholars of Finance team, we're excited to try to help create that shift as well, and do whatever little part that we play, whatever little part that we can, and do whatever we can to help. I want to actually transition here a bit to some of your work outside of General Mills. You've talked about a lot of these conversations that you have with other CFOs, with other leaders, and I know that you've had a lot of conversations within the Aspen Institute. For our listeners who don't know, the Aspen Institute was founded in 1949 and has since become one of the largest nonprofits in the world, driving change through dialogue, leadership, and action to help solve the most important challenges on Earth. And Kofi, our mutual friend, Christopher Ellis, founded the Finance Leaders Fellowship at the Aspen Institute, which has a mission very similar to Scholars of Finance. And you were a fellow in that program early on in this program's life cycle. Can you tell our listeners a bit about the Aspen Institute, the Finance Leaders Fellowship, your experience, and how you think that group will impact the future of finance?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why you and I have built such a bond is I see the mission that you are embarking upon with Scholars of Finance is serving certainly early in people's finance careers, a need around keeping values in the conversation for finance professionals. And I think it's important, by the way, if you look at, we have had over the course of a century and change of finance issues that maybe some of which have originated in Wall Street, there's very clear opportunity for finance to occupy a different perch and influence decision making at the individual level. But I think that the thing that attracted me to Aspen was this idea that at the center of all of the things that we are doing in finance, we can enrich society and each other if we are proactive in thinking about the impacts of our decisions through an ethical and moral framework. Um, and it is rigorous from an intellectual standpoint in that it brings you into a conversation starting with some of the great foundational philosophical touch points, everything from Aristotle to Machiavelli um, to Confucius, and you are at all points along the way being stressed to think about society, community, and values in a very different way. And some of those ideas compete with the things you believe. Some of them are confirmatory, and you are actually in a process of debating with other people who are kind of on the same path of figuring out, okay, what do I want the center of my leadership to look like? And going through, you talked about being deliberate and practicing, but going through a deliberate process of setting up a leadership model for themselves. What is the footprint I want to leave on the world as I go about doing my business in commerce? And what is the role of finance and finance's responsibility to the greater society? Does
Mm,
finance not care about these issues as of equity and justice? And is our job really just to go maximize shareholder value at all costs? Um, right? Or do we have a responsibility to the greater society to be thinking about and contemplating those questions that aren't explicitly answered, even as we go out and find more efficient ways to do X, right? I think those are the things that I find so attractive about the Aspen Institute and the Finance Leadership Fellowship. And that is also the reason why I think you and I have built such a foundational relationship, because I see that you are trying to do that and build that into the wiring of finance, a generation of finance professionals coming into finance, and to have them be thinking intentionally about that at the front part of their career is an amazingly powerful concept. And I'm tremendously inspired by the work you've done so far.
well, that is very, very kind of you, and I take that as a very, very high compliment. That means a lot. And my hope is that as our students, as scholars of finance, age call it 17 to 25 ish on a broad range, go through SOF, through undergrad, freshman through senior year,
Yeah.
they remain an alumni. Now once they're in their mid 30s, to mid 40s, 10 years later, 15 years later, they can then apply for round two, kind of the master class of this. And then they can apply to be a finance leaders, a
You know
leadership
what?
fellowship.
That'll work. That'll work. We'll talk to Chris about it. But
We'll make sure
I'm
to send
sure
in the
Milton
episode.
Friedman is it would probably have something to say about it if he were alive. But I do think we're in a different period, right? And
Hmm.
I do think both of those concepts can exist and coexist and can be self-reinforcing. The notion of shareholder value, but also being and doing good for society and being thoughtful about your footprint on society, as opposed to ignoring those things and believing they aren't the province of business leaders. I think that's the core of the notion here for me, that fuels me, because I believe that. If I didn't believe that, I would have a hard time being in the profession I'm in.
Right. I know we have a couple minutes, so I want to ask you one last question.
Sure.
Um, I want to ask you about your increasing involvement in Scholars of Finance. Last year, you spoke at kind of a softball.
Yeah.
Last year, you spoke at one of our symposia. Thank you again for that, by the way. Since then, you've spoken to our members during a chapter speaker series. You've become a donor of Scholars of Finance. You've
And
become
now, I'm being interviewed here.
yeah, and here you are on the podcast, right? Getting increasingly involved, being a mentor and friend to me, and just kind of helping guide me in the journey as well. I'm curious, what is it about Scholars of Finance that continues to keep you involved? And why might you encourage our listeners who might be learning about SOF for the first time to get involved, or even our current members to get more involved? Why SOF, Kofi?
Yeah, look, I think there is there's a lot of attention paid to how you get into a finance career in the professional training you get along the way. And there's not a lot of attention paid to how you conduct yourself once you get there. And that foundationally is why I think you need an organization like Scholars of Finance, right? I will tell you, I'm going to tell you a story from early in my career and why I think having an organization like Scholar of Finance can be exceedingly helpful for people. I was asked to do something that I didn't in my core think was right, even though the people in the chain, probably we'll call it 5, 6 levels above me, had the authority to ask me to do it. And I was, troubled by it enough to go ask for, some professional advice from somebody in the organization who I trusted, a crusty guy who just generally had a pretty gruff demeanor, but I think had I knew had a really good moral compass. And I explained the situation and said, "Hey, I don't know what to do." And he kind of looked at me and he said, "That's BS. You know exactly what you want to do. You are just looking for me to tell you that you should go do it." And he said, "What's the worst thing that's going to happen to you?" And he said, "You're going to get fired. That's the worst thing." And he goes, "If you get fired, what do you conclude? Do you want to? Is this a place you want to work at? If they'd fire you for doing something that you think is right, and you're earnestly bringing it forward from a place of that positive intent, you don't want to work there." He said, "Get out of my office." But I think for me, the value of an organization like Scholars of Finance is it will actually help you get in the mindset of thinking about the kinds of moral, ethical, and community impacts of the decisions you make before you start your career. And the power of that is if you think that way, and you are training yourself to think that way, I think you are going to be a much more an effective and engaged ambassador for the finance function, which, I will tell you, we don't always get a great rap outside of our own community. And that we are viewed as not caring about values and ethics and society. And I actually don't think that's true from my own walks through the finance profession. But that there is a role for us to do to lift up both that perspective and then also to improve our impact and our footprint along the way. And this organization is certainly a big part of how you help people, think about how they conduct their careers and comport themselves, and more important, the leadership that they project as they move through their career, even from the earliest days.
Thanks, Kofi. I really appreciate that. I think one question we'll probably even start adding to the list of questions that we try to pose to our members is, why do you want to go into a career in finance? Simon Sinek's famous "Start with Why." I've been having a lot of conversations with some friends over the last week, thinking that would be a really, really rich starting point in the Scholars of Finance candidacy and membership journey. So maybe something that you and I can unpack a little bit and design on our next call. I'm so grateful.
I mean, I look forward to that.
Yeah,
we
yeah.
need another hour for that one.
Exactly. Kofi, it has been such a pleasure to have you on the Investing in Integrity podcast. Have really, really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah, the 50-ish, 55 minutes we've had is not nearly enough, obviously. And I'm excited to have you on again. Excited to have you continue to speak to our students.
Happy to do it.
Mentor us, invest in us. We're grateful for your leadership. And I just hope you have an amazing, amazing rest of your week, and look forward to having you on again soon.
Thank you very much. You're too kind. I've really enjoyed the conversation.